Great. So we're going to get going on with this first panel discussion. This is around startup corporate collaboration, which is, as I mentioned earlier, this is the bread and butter of what we do. And so we have on the panel 2 startups and 2 corporates. Ali Azerbaiani, co-founder and CTO of Cogito. We have Ray Goffer, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Climastel. You heard from him earlier this morning. Nazir Bore, global manager, technology scouting and venturing at ExxonMobil. And then Luca from Swiss Re, we just heard from him. The goal here is to, through this conversation, share some lessons that they've learned working with corporates and working with startups, and so that hopefully there's some mistakes or challenges that you can avoid as well. We're going to take some audience Q&A throughout the discussion, so please start sending those via Pigeonhole. Just as a starting point, I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to do a quick intro, what their company does and where it is, and in the context of startup and corporate collaboration. So let's start with Ali.
Sure. So our company is Cogito. Our technology is based around machine learning and understanding of human conversations. Our product is for real-time coaching of agents and supervisors in call centers. We're in our 10th year. We're in a growth stage. Our customers are primarily large Fortune 100 to Fortune 1000 companies with enormous call centers of thousands, tens of thousands of agents. And so we interact with corporates a lot as customers, and that's where we are now.
Great. Ray Goffer with Climastel. You heard from me before. So we do weather. We are about 3 and a bit years in, post B round, and we work a lot since day one, basically, with really large corporations, from telcos to our car companies to airlines, both as partners and as customers.
Good morning. My name is Nazir Bore. I'm with ExxonMobil, and ExxonMobil is basically a global oil and gas company. We take oil and gas out of ground, move it around the world, convert it into useful products like fuels and materials, and sell it around the world. In liquids value chain, we are end-to-end, from the stuff in the ground to the gas station. In gas value chain, we are not in all parts of value chain, but we touch, in this room, in our home, many, many pieces that you may not be even aware of. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Luca Marighetti, for those who have just joined, I'm the group head of tech transformation at Swiss Re. Swiss Re is probably the largest reinsurance company globally. I say probably because sometimes it's Munich Re, sometimes it's us. Maybe a word about what reinsurance does. Reinsurance is basically insuring insurance company, and is one of the most, if not the most, global business there is. Why? Because in order to perform that risk transformation, you need to insure across different jurisdictions and basically continents. So that's why reinsurance is one of the very few industries that are not really constrained in places like, for instance, China. So.
Great. So in terms of the discussion, I was thinking we would try to organize it around a pre-pilot phase, a pilot phase, and then a post-pilot phase. The pilot is sort of the typical relationship that we see, the typical model that we see in our office between startups and our corporate members. Everyone wants to try the product and then decide, okay, what's the right implementation, what's the right business relationship. So let's start with pre-pilot. And this is sort of high level. What role do startups play in corporate innovation? Maybe start with you, Luke, and sort of maybe contrast, as you've talked about the academic relationship. What's different about working with a startup than other types of innovation activities?
Working with startups, the first thing is you need to have a use case. Otherwise, what are the startups supposed to help you with? And if you're not clear about that, it's like going to academics without a problem. The other thing that I believe is relevant is, and that's a problem from the corporate side, that 10,000s of startups. A lot of it is hot air. So how do you find startups with a sound engineering behind it? Because we're not an engineering company, and that is a real challenge. Once you have the use case, how do you get to the right startups that you can trust so that it is worth really starting the process from proof of concept to implementation?
So the answer to that question is you come to MIT.
That's why I'm here.
Nazir, what are the problems that startups can solve better and faster from your perspective?
Startups, we have domain knowledge, we have access to markets, and we have use cases. Startups bring unhindered, uninhibited solutions free from all the legacy issues that are there in corporates. And so I think startups bring speed, startups bring unhindered solutions, and startups also bring not just technologies, but how it is packaged in a business model. And I think that is a big piece of what we look for. It's how is the technology packaged in a business model for us, particularly in the emerging energy space. You kind of look at startups as digital and non-digital, and those require different handling techniques.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ray, your company, what's interesting about it is that you haven't necessarily honed in on one industry as a starting point. Weather is interesting and valuable to so many industries. What is your perspective on this? What do you, how do you look at what you bring to corporates, and does it maybe vary across industries?
Yeah, it definitely does, but I think the common kind of theme is that you have to do a lot of thinking for your prospect partners, right? So we spend a ton of time thinking about weather and how it's implemented or how it's impacting different use cases, and everybody's interested to talk because everybody has some sort of sensitivity to weather. It's really useful, we talk with Richard, to come with a bunch of ideas that are quite well developed and propose them and then have a much more kind of high-level conversation and deeper than just like let them figure it all out and say what they can do with your technology.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are there particular things that you're looking for? Ali, maybe this one for you. Are there particular things you're looking for in a corporate partner as you sit down and start building that relationship? Are there things that you're looking for in terms of a shared vision, perhaps? Or other things as you're trying to evaluate, is this a path we want to go down?
Yeah, so you certainly have to have a clear value proposition, as Luca was pointing out. And the important thing from the startup's point of view is you've got to develop a relationship with a champion inside the organization. Because large corporations are complicated and you need someone to navigate the organization for you. You also have to have a relationship there with someone at a high enough level that they can actually make things happen. Because often what you're competing against in a large corporation is other priorities. And in particular, as a software company, we need to interact with the IT departments of these companies, and these IT departments have their own priorities, their own agendas, and unless you have a business owner who's a champion for pushing this innovation through, it's very difficult to navigate and make things happen, and that can really slow down the process.
Nazir or Luca, do you want to sort of add to that? What do you have in place internally to?
I mean, I completely agree. You need an internal champion, but when a startup comes, it's not clear where exactly is the highest value use case which is movable. Because we may have 10 different use cases, maybe 4 or 5 different champions, and you need help in kind of figuring out who are the people who are going to move, which ones of them are painkillers versus vitamins, okay?
Right.
And that is an iterative process. That's There is openness needed from both ends, and sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't fit.
And probably another thing that I'd mention at the pre-pilot phase is you have to devise a way of measuring the result. It's best to do that ahead of time because a lot of times it can be ambiguous whether the pilot was successful or not. So in terms of searching for the right champion or the right use case within a company, it's important to find one where you're confident that you can measure the result, and then you can agree on what standard you need to meet to consider the pilot successful.
Mm-hmm. What would you add, Luca?
I have experiences with both those gentlemen. I didn't really realize they would be on stage. But
on the spot.
I think taking it on from you need to have somebody who champions and helps the startup navigate. Similar to how the ILP helps you navigate MIT. That's the one side. Yeah. Now, this guy is a kind of unfortunate guy. I experience that every day. Because even if you have a use case, it's not obvious that the organization will take it. Why? Because the reason for interacting with a new piece of technology is to change things. And people hate it. And you need to overcome the fact that they hate it, or they think they have something better at hand. And even if you manage to bring them in, and actually, the relationship with him, he was a 3-people company when I first met them 3 years ago. I thought, this thing is going to become something, and I brought them now in a different context. But even when you got there and you've got a POC and you have something measurable, as you know with Zurich Insurance, you can demonstrate you have the results. And then, bang, somebody kills it at the very end, despite the evidence. And again, the real obstacle here is that applying those technology means changing business models. And you have interest groups in corporations, and they don't want that change. So that's why you need up to CEO involvement and first-hand involvement if you really things to move. And if the CEO is, when Swiss Re asked me, do you want to be the tech transformation manager? I said, yeah, dear Christian Mumenthaler, will you be sponsoring that personally? I cannot do that, it's too much. No, you don't need to do anything, you just need to say it. And the moment you say it, then the corporation will understand it's a priority, and then we have a chance of making a few things move. Not everything, but at least a few. Because people know if it doesn't work, it will be on your desk. So that is that much it requires, at least in insurance. I'm not sure for other industries.
I think change management is difficult in all industries. So one approach to that is a lot of corporations have innovation centers that are specifically have a specific mission for strategic projects and change. So they're generally a little bit more friendly to the idea of delivering something that can produce change. But at some point you have to gain the buy-in of business owners. So if you have a strong innovation group in the company and they're really eager themselves to prove their value, then they can help you along in pushing it through the business.
I guess I'll jump in. I think two points to Luca's piece is that, one, you really have to understand, there might be a big use case, but as Luca said, the startup or the industry is reluctant to move in that direction for various reasons. So, there's only so much you can do to make these large companies move there. One thing you can do is work with much smaller companies and prove it, and maybe then, they'll see it, and we've seen it happening in other places where you work with someone much smaller and that works, and then the big guys are like, okay, we need to have that, right? The other piece is you really have to as a startup, you can, especially coming from MIT, you need to not be shy to go to the really high levels of these organizations. And it might sound really intimidating, but the only way we've seen of making big things happening with companies of that size is you get to the CEO through some connection of your investors, of school, of somewhere, and if they know if it's a priority and if it's interesting, and you can get a much shorter process on a go no go by arranging such meeting. CEO says, this is interesting for us as the company, you know it's going to happen, versus says, well, maybe, and connects you to someone. And
Yeah. So as a follow-up to that, is it worth engaging with corporate where you know you're not in the top 3 strategic priorities or top 5, whatever? Luca, Nazir, thoughts? Be honest.
I mean, if it's not a top priority, it's a work process change. It cuts across many departments, has business model innovation. You have a lot of things going against you.
yeah.
If it's a rifle shot in one department, a real big pain, top 10 priorities in the corporation, you can fly. So I think, you know, and then as a startup, just like what we do, you have to look at where is the biggest bang for your buck.
But I think you need to do both. Because I'm just thinking of my case with Climacell, okay? I happened to meet them by accident, really.
Yeah.
And then I thought, wow, you know, memorize Climacell, they have an interesting idea, an interesting piece of technology. It was totally irrelevant for me when I met them, but I didn't forget them. So, and then, you know, 4 years, 3 years down the road, we hit the problem for which Climacell had the answer. And I looked at them and saw they developed. So let's reconnect and see whether we can do something. So on the one side, you know, it may, to really engage with a corporation makes sense in terms of investing resources if this is one of the priorities they're working upon. But I think there's value in interacting with corporation in terms of creating the awareness of what they're doing and that they exist. And sometimes it takes years, but if you have something really robust and a strong value proposition, corporations at a point and unexpectedly will come back.
Let's take an audience question here. How do you decide if a startup is ready for collaboration? So imagine you're sitting from across the table and you're meeting with these startups. What kind of things are you looking for?
I'm looking for substance. And very often, you know, if people come to me saying, you know, I've got this marvelous thing, it runs on the blockchain, it's machine learning, AI, so that's the end of the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm actually hearing the same thing from startups where if there's a corporate inquiry saying, okay, we want to learn about something about AI, you know, that's usually a red flag for that they're not serious.
It's funny, but we have 30 PhDs in a company of 100 people. We have a ton of AI and ML applications. They all have, but we learned that some people say you should have it in the pitch and you should have it, everywhere. And we learned that if you really want to get to the people who understand you and you talk about substance, using these buzzwords, even though we actually do this stuff at a quite high level, is not the right thing to do.
Right. All right, so let's move to the pilot phase here. What are some common challenges that appear in the pilot phase, and are they a symptom of poor pre-pilot work, perhaps?
Yeah, so I mentioned one already, which is getting metrics determined ahead of time. Another thing that happens is you typically have to do some kind of, if you're a software company, you typically have to do some kind of integration, which requires collaboration with the IT team. So that was another thing that I mentioned, is that you have to have a good relationship there. One of the things that we try to do when we're working with a corporate is to make sure that they have a dedicated resource on their side, because if they don't, then that means we're all alone in trying to negotiate priorities with their IT department. But if you have a project manager on their side who's going to be able to set up the right meetings and move things along, that really helps in execution of a pilot.
Maybe just add that, especially on technical projects, which I guess all are, you gotta calibrate your expectations on timelines. And just like as a startup, you're like, okay, we have, this is a runway. We need to show these milestones by the end of that quarter, and then the corporate guys are just like, they're gone for a month for some reason. And that's okay. It's going to continue. Like some projects you expected or you thought are going to take 6 months end up taking 18 months. It doesn't mean that they're not going to happen. You just need to kind of build and plan for that extended time periods.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we tend not to lose deals. They just haven't happened yet
Exactly.
for a long time.
They're in the pipe.
In addition to the things that were mentioned from the corporate side, we tend to look at what is limiting this opportunity. Is it the kind of the demand side, the market side of it? Is it the technology? Sometimes the limiting factors is really the internal organizational readiness. You know, either skill level, working across, and sometimes it's the system readiness because many actors outside our company have to work together. And so very clear understanding on which readiness level is limiting its acceptance and how you're going about addressing it is quite important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can add something to that, because we're trying to move even a step ahead. We used to have innovation teams and center and the usual ivory towers. We've dismantled all of this. It didn't work for us. I don't see that working for the industry. What we want is the business owner to be in charge. Mm-hmm. If the business owner is in charge, he will find the resources, make things happen. We're not always successful. It's a process. But when people ask me, how large is your innovation team, my answer is 14,500. Everybody. We need to bring the beast inside and then make sure that we enable people to interact in a proper manner with a startup. It's not trivial, but I don't see any other way.
Yeah. So we had actually one audience question here. How would you suggest corporations should be org structured in order to welcome startups? Environment into their investment portfolio where core business legacy is way too much. So you're saying there should be very little overhead, very small, nimble teams?
My team, anybody who innovates will be fired on the spot. That's the job of the business. Okay, we're facilitating the process. So, and then the ideal situation is when you find a function or business that is where the pain point is so big that they need to change the business model. So when you identify them and say, okay, let me help you finding the right partner to change, likelihood that technology those days would be part of the solution is near 100%. So, and if they see value and a need to go through this change management process, then they will embrace it. And then it's very powerful because they get all the resources they need.
Yeah. Nazir, anything you can share about how you guys are org structured?
We are org structured by having a single tech scouting and ventures organization, but we have embedded sort of innovation groups in different businesses. And this is the model that we have been experimenting for the last few years, and it seems to be producing results. Only time will tell. I think getting the ideas or practices or technologies from outside is the easy part of it. Making it stick inside the organization is the most difficult part of it. Okay? Yeah. And for us, if we do a POC and use it in one site, it's not a success for us because we may have 40 sites. And unless you use it across our asset base, you spend more money than what you get out. So for us, the scaling part is equally important. So,
Let's maybe bring up the question here. For the corporates, how deep into the organization do you promote engagement with startup ecosystems? What about while working on specific use cases?
I can answer. I mean, the way we do it is, while my team may be the one organizing the process, whenever we've identified the 3, 4, 5 potential partner, we bring in the people, the business people, and they have to make the decision and engage. So, because if you take a decision and go back, they come and say, yeah, but my cousin has a friend who has written an algorithm that makes marvels. So, you need to expose them directly to people like those two gentlemen, and then it's rather easy.
And how is that done more specifically? Any
Well,
insight you can share?
no, the process that we follow is basically we've recognized that you need to go and fish where the fish is. Okay, so now everybody says every location says we have great tech. Maybe true. I know that there are a few locations where the likelihood of finding the right startup is higher, and that's here, is Palo Alto, is Israel, and is Beijing for our purposes. And maybe, anyway, those three are the most important. So then we've built a set of relationships there. They work in similar yet different way. So in Palo Alto is the VCs, here is the MIT ecosystem, and so on. And then the moment we have the use cases, we post the use cases to those places. Here is ALP, basically. And they say, okay, having seen your use cases, those are the 3 companies you should meet. So then we do some due diligence. And after that, we bring in the business people to have a direct interaction. So that's our process.
So for example, when you were here, I think, was it last week or the week before, you had one of these sessions where you brought business people to MIT.
Yeah. And eventually, they started having conversations to do something in the real business.
We have meetings with, with the various business groups, but then really the relationship, I mean, Luca is really the facilitator and the champion, but we need to make sure that the guys who manage that use case are the ones, that care about it, and that they're the ones we do most of our interactions with to actually get the project going.
Yeah. So let's get back to the pilot phase here, and just wondering, the question I have is, what does success look like? What determines a successful pilot? Can failure be a net positive outcome? Is it okay to fail consistently, let's say?
I have the problem that we fail too little. And the reason is that means we're not aggressive and experimental enough. People look then at a POC like they would be looking at a decision for final implementation. And the one thing I'm still struggling on making it happen is, can we please do the $20,000 investment type POC before we have a bigger discussion? And the tendency of at least corporations like the one I'm working for is to have a fundamental discussion before starting the smaller things. So more smaller things and more failures would actually be good. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the cost of the pilot is maybe a balancing factor there. What we found, because we have to do a complex integration in order to adequately pilot our software, because it interacts directly with the telephone system. That the investment on both sides for the pilot is quite high. So we definitely want to set it up for success, which means being selective about making sure that we have alignment on the value proposition, and as I mentioned before, sort of an agreement of what success looks like ahead of time, so that once we're done with the pilot, we can roll on into an expansion and start testing further. So I understand the point of view that from the corporate point of view that we should probably fail more often. From the startup's point of view, it's pretty expensive to fail on pilots. So we have to be very selective about which ones we do and set them up so that they have a high likelihood of success.
I'll just add to that you want to maybe help your partners understand kind of the different options and costs, and not necessarily, we can run a model for all of Brazil, super high resolution, it's going to cost $1 million a year. Let's start the POC with something that is ready and quicker. You guys might not see the same results as you would in the full-scale implementation, but it will give you kind of a good sign of whether you want to go there or not. And then the decision making on the corporate side is much faster if the numbers are lower and it's like lower, limited scale.
Right. Moving forward here, so assuming you've done the pilot and there's some good results, how do you move from the pilot to business unit installation?
So what we try to do is we try to set that up ahead of time because the goal is to do a rollout, and so what we try to get a common understanding ahead of time of what it would take to prove the value and ROI of the product, so that if we prove that, it's an easy case to go forward. A lot of work has to be done up front in software integration, and particularly these days, we're talking about cyber risk and all of that. There's a lot of security work that has to be done ahead of time, and so again, there's a huge investment in the pilot. So the approach that we take is just is having that all agreed ahead of time. We usually have a 3-year plan agreed to ahead of time, so that if we meet the milestone, we can just roll into it. If you wait until the pilot is done to have that conversation, then you've got another long, drawn-out process and a lot of other obstacles you have to overcome.
Nazir, from your perspective?
I mean, when we do the POC, we have kind of a rough idea as to if it's successful, what are the things you have to do to get into the first site as well as across our enterprise. And so folks have a view as to what are the steps needed to go to commercial use. Once again, I kind of separate digital versus non-digital. They have different challenges because in the non-digital space, in the hardware space, especially if it's tied to a turnaround, then they have the cycles. Turnarounds in big manufacturing sites, those are the times where every 3-4 years, the site shuts down and you can put new stuff in it. So that's the time scale that limits it. In digital, very different system integration issues are. And in hardware, which is not tied to turnarounds, those time scales are much easier. So in some ways, we have a view at the start before POC as to what are the hurdles and what is the likely timeline in which we're going to implement things. So preparation, start small, and make sure you have staffed it. The big challenge is after you started, staff moves around due to different priorities, and you really want to avoid that.
For me, part of the POC is also understanding the consequences. It's very different for every different application. Something like Cogito is doing the POC is very expensive because you're touching systems already in some fundamental ways, and you're mobilizing people. So in other cases, let's climb a cell, just get a sample of data and see whether we can do a risk model. It's a completely different scope. So when you do the POC, however, you may discover a number of things that are an impediment. So I was saying earlier, reinsurance is a global business. Now, we're interested in global weather data. Okay, can we extract weather data from sensor in China and process them in the West? We don't, or vice versa. We don't know. That is something you may discover in the course of the POC. And only then you know what the scope is, and then you determine the timings and the like.
Yeah, I guess one really big lesson here is that if you build a good relationship, you have to start the relationship with something that's easy for both sides to accomplish relatively quickly. But then when you build it, with a company like Swiss Re, there's probably 100 other stuff that we could do over the course of the next decade. We're not going to do all of them at once, even though in the first conversation everybody brings all these ideas. You have to really be focused. Okay, what is a quick win for everyone, not just the startup, because the corporate want to see that something is happening. We can bring in the next quarter, year. When we're there, when we've showed some successes, now let's go and explode on all these other stuff that we can do, bringing data from China. But starting with the most complicated one is not the right.
Yeah. I think we're running out of time here. So we're going to wrap up at this point. So please join me in thanking the panelists.